mom and pops were ever going to actually arrange our marriages and force us to marry someone. But without our parents' blessing, there was simply no way that any relationship would ever be able to begin. Years and years of IBL teaching had taught us that no good Christian child should consider going against our parents' wishes. Number one on the list of requirements of a future spouse was that they had the approval of our parents. Without that, it was game over before things had even begun. We were encouraged not to just sit around waiting for our future mate to show up, but instead occupy our time in ways that distracted us from constant thoughts of marriage. Mr. Gothard even taught that it was best to make a vow of single service, committing a specific number of years to serving God while single. His teaching was compelling, but I preferred to commit to serve God, my family, and others just until God brought my future husband along. I dressed conservatively, but inside I was a normal girl interested in romance and love just like anyone else. So they were also encouraged to tell their parents if they liked someone, and Jim Bob was known to try to set up the girls with suitors, and they were not allowed to actually approach a guy for courtship. Only a boy was allowed to approach them. So there's limitations in these relationships, and as Jill said, they can't happen unless mom and dad approve, even if you're 34 years old. And the same book, and in Ginger's book, she speaks about the teaching that Gothard had that women and girls cannot move out of their family home until they're married. Boys have a completely different set of standards. Girls cannot. Even though some of the Duggar boys remain at home, they have more freedom, and even Jeremiah and Jed lived on their own before they were ever married. There's been so much discussion about this marriage and why it feels a little bit staged or even orchestrated by the family and what this could mean for Jana. Now, regardless, Jana seems happy, Stephen seems happy, and in their world, this might feel happy for them. You have to remember the IBLP is very different than our world, and the way that you and I might find our mate and find our one is very different, and their concept of happiness is also very different. So in Jana's world, this might be her happily ever after, but Jill's book proves that it was up to Jim Bob to decide if a relationship can go through, if the wedding can happen. It's his ultimate decision at the end of the day. And that's the teaching of Gothard. You know, some of the girls that have married into the family, like Katie Nikatsu, went as extreme as allowing her father to even pick out her suitor, regardless if she knew the guy or not. So this concept that there's freedom of choice in this world is it's a very fine line. The girls feel like there's a choice when the reality is there's not. Now, when it comes to this wedding, there was a lot of questions about Jill and Jana, and I did a video the other day and I discussed how this kind of underlined some of the damage that's been done to the family. And Jill wrote about in her book, Counting the Cost, that when she and Derek broke from the family and decided to ask their dad for payment and push back and say no to filming and push back about, you know, what was happening within the family, push back against some of these rules and guidelines that were happening and these expectations that the kids basically live under his control as the head patriarch of the family, regardless if they were married or not. Because under the belief system of the IBLP, there's like the umbrella of authority, and so the kids are supposed to stay under the umbrella of protection of their parents. But even after married, some patriarchs will say that they still have their children underneath their umbrella, even though they're not. It doesn't make sense, but Jim Bob, according to Jill, had this belief that he wanted to have more control over the married kids' lives than he really ought to have. And that fight between her and Jim Bob created friction in the family because she was also taught not to disobey her parents and always listen to them. And as a result of her disobedience, Jim Bob used and weaponized her sisters and her other siblings against her, and her relationships with her siblings still underneath his control waned and got very fractured, and she became the scapegoat, even though Josh is the one in prison. So Jill not being included in the wedding wasn't like necessarily her choice. It's the choice of the bride, and Jill did answer questions. She shared a bunch of pictures on her Instagram, and she said, "Why weren't you a bridesmaid? No hate, just genuinely curious." And she said, "I don't know, but it should always be the bride's decision." And said, someone else wrote, "Wow, what a wedding. Dancing, Jana looks fabulous and deserves her happiness after waiting so long. And she said, yeah, the first Duggar wedding with a first dance. Jill also answered this question, thanks for sharing. I hope your boys didn't miss out seeing their cousins. And she said, our kids were there the night before for the family dinner. We went kid-free to the wedding, and it was nice since space was tight anyways. And she shared photographs with people from the show and the crew. So there was some crew members there, but it was not filmed for a show. Another person said, some were questioning if you attended the wedding. I'm so glad you did. You look lovely as always. And she said, yes. Thanks, yes, we were invited to attend. She was a beautiful bride. We wish them all the best. And then someone else said, I'm so glad you guys went. I was worried you didn't go. And she said, we wouldn't have missed it. So Jill's obvious exclusion from the wedding party was what I was speaking about when I spoke about the rift in the family, right? So Jill and Jana were like best friends growing up, and Jill and Jana's relationship only fractured once she and Derek split from the norms of the family and didn't obey what Jim Bob wanted them to do, okay? And then Jill wrote about in her book, Counting the Cost, which all of you should read if you're questioning. If you're someone that's here that supports the Duggars, I would encourage you to read Jill's book. I would encourage you to read the court records. I would encourage you to read the testimony from Josh's trial. I would encourage you to read the actual court records, not just what the Duggars tell you. Because this wedding on the surface looks good, right? Because Jim Bob is able to take back a narrative, but it doesn't actually change anything. He thinks it will, but it doesn't. And I can tell you why there's been a lot of resistance from people about my coverage specifically. Jim Bob Duggar clearly has a motive with all of this and with what the photos are and what this is supposed to be for him. I know this because when I shared photographs from the wedding from other people sharing photographs, so Jana shared a bunch of photographs, I shared those to my Instagram, everyone sharing them all over Instagram, but the photographer that took the photos specifically targeted me and was accusing me of defaming the family with a false narrative about the family, and that I needed to take down all of the photos. The only people allowed to share photos are people that are going to uplift the family and uplift Jana and share the beauty of the day. No one's allowed to use the photos to cast a negative light on the family. That's what they told me. Now, I don't know if that's the photographer's point of view or if that is Jim Bob. But it seems weird, right? We all know Jim Bob knows who I am. We all know that he's keeping track of this channel. We all know that he's watching, and he pays attention to the criticism. And he knows that people from his insiders speak to me. He knows that former friends of his speak. In fact, I asked one of his former friends, why are they acting like this? Like, why would I have to remove all my photos that everyone else is sharing? And one photo, for instance, I just shared and I said, look, Jill's in the back here. Everything's good. I never said she wasn't invited. Here you go. Here's the family photo. There wasn't anything negative about the photo at all, but I had to take that one down too because I was defaming the family, right? So Jim Bob never reached out to me. Never. And to be clear, like, I'm not going to try to disrespect a photographer and not, if they say, I don't want you to use my photos, I won't use your photos. So every photo that you've seen in this video are photos that are actually taken by someone else that are not tagged to the photographer, that were shared either by Steven's siblings or Jana's siblings or friends of the family. I'm not sharing any official photographs from the wedding anymore, and Jim Bob is losing his ever-loving mind about it. And so not only am I getting messages from the photographer, who, by the way, like, every media outlet is using these photos, and the headlines are not great, right? And a lot of them are bringing up the child abuse and the sexual abuse and the CSAM and Josh Duggar in these articles. And unfortunately, this photographer is working for a family that has scandal, but Jim Bob only wants to control how these photographs are used, okay? And that's why I'm pretty confident he sold them to people so that he could control how they're used. And he's known to do this. I'm not saying that he's telling the photographer to do this, I'm just saying. And this morning, on top of that, I woke up to an email from someone that claimed to be a friend of the Duggar family, which actually made me kind of laugh because there is no love like Duggar hate. And the person said, wow, I just want to say thank you for your YouTube videos regarding Jana Duggar. They prove what a lost, deceitful, and wicked world we live in. Your reporting is a disgraceful shame of mostly your opinion and assumption. You obviously believe the false information you report. May people who read and view your reporting be discerning and wise and not believe your twisted view. So my reporting includes stuff from Jill's book, stuff from court records, the obvious scandals that have happened that have been very public. There's no false reporting here. Do I share my opinion sometimes? Yes. But this is what they're really upset right now because they wanted to sweep this all under the rug. And so I reached out to an old friend of the Duggar family to find out what this is all about. And they said they're just pissed off that you're doing a story. They are just sheeple of the Duggars or the Wismans' false narrative about what's going on the past 20 years. They're trying to move on and brush the huge stains under the rug, meaning what's happened in the family. And I said, this wedding feels like damage control. I have never seen any of his daughters get this kind of royal send-off for a wedding. And the friend said, sure, they went underground for the whole engagement and dating process, so it was not to get any negative publishing out of it. And now that the wedding is public and all over the internet, they still don't want anything negative or truthful about anything. The friend believes that they kept this all under wraps, not just for financial purposes, but because it would reduce negative publishing attached to this relationship, and that this moment could serve as sort of a grandstanding for Jim Bob. In fact, they continued by saying, this is an opportunity to try to rewrite history about how these daughters have been second-class citizens in the Duggar family and have had to lie and handle sexual abuse in order to protect the family business, Duggar Inc., and promote and grow Gothard's IBLP ministry. So they're trying to bend the thinking on what the true story of all that has gone on reflects to a new supply of converts that they can use to try to save Gothard's IBLP and the images of the leading families in the IBLP. And I said, oh, this actually makes sense. But Jana's dress is so not IBLP approved, and they said they've got to change the image and erase history or the show or the Gothard ministry to continue on. It's just morphed into a new form, and they're going to erase Josh Duggar and Bill Gothard from the history books of all of this stuff. So to them, all of this is sort of a way to flip the narrative and showcase the great family of the IBLP in a positive light. And so in their opinion, and this is someone that was friends with the Duggars for decades, knows very well how Jim Bob operates, has studied extensively how this IBLP utilizes the media and propaganda to push back. And even Jill wrote about in her book how they utilized a guy named Chad Gallagher to promote propaganda and positive information about the family to try to dispel and drown out the negativity. And so what the friend is saying is this wedding is a way to try to brush everything under the rug and sort of welcome in a new era of the Duggars and say, like, all of that happened before is not. And what you see before and what you saw before is not. And we're going to ignore all of the details about what's happened in the family. And all of it is because the wedding was so different, right? So they have to change the image to dispel what Jill said. And this is what a lot of cult leaders will do. As soon as one narrative is put out, they're going to do the exact opposite to try to prove that defector wrong. So Jill remains the scapegoat, and they're going to say, well, see, she lied. She said that my daughters don't have control, or that they can't have the weddings they want, or that we have to choose, or whatever. And this is why I think Jana's interviews were very much like blaming herself for not being able to find someone, even though it's Jill that writes in the book that no marriages can go through without their dad's approval. So at the end of the day, Jim Bob is using Jana almost as a sacrificial lamb to fulfill his agenda of trying to look better in the public's image. And he doesn't even have to say anything. He doesn't even have to have an image put out of himself. But he's going to try to intimidate people, whether it's by using, in my opinion, and I don't know if this is true, someone to reach out to me and say, you can't use these photos unless it's positive, or having someone email me and call me wicked and deceitful and untruthful. Regardless, I think it's important that the public remember that none of this changes.